I was really excited and pumped to hear Eddie's message from last week, so I wanted to recap a little bit of what he talked about. In John 8:32, you have the famous verse, "You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And so one of the things Eddie talked about was freedom is always defined in a specific way, and a lot of times as Westerners, we define freedom as freedom from something, the avoidance of something. But the way the Bible looks at freedom is it's freedom to. You get to be something in freedom. And yet there is a freedom from something, and the freedom from is no longer being a slave to sin. And one of the ways Eddie defined that is you need to be able to confront the brutal facts. You need to accept and recognize the reality that we are sinful, that we have practices, habits of sin behavior, and these thought patterns and behaviors trap us. You could even call it, maybe the modern day equivalent is addictive behaviors, you might say, compulsive behaviors that influence how we think and how we act. So when the Bible talks about being a slave to sin, when Jesus talks about in the Gospel of John being a slave to sin, he's talking about being a slave to these thought and behavior patterns. And then the way that you discover freedom is by being able to hear the truth. The truth is what sets you free. However, what's difficult is we often build our worldview on illusions. And one of the questions Eddie asked was, what illusion are you protecting from being destroyed? Okay, let me say that one again, because I shiver when I think about that. What illusion are you protecting from being destroyed? And what I want to do today is I want to look at three illusions. I want to look at three lies that we have bought into, that the Jews in this passage have bought into, and I want to drill down on them, because here's the thing. At the close of Eddie's message, he gave us a picture of what it was like to live in the Father's house, that you get to abide in the security and permanent love and affection of God the Father in his house. And yet to go to that house, to be in that house, means you need to allow the house of illusions that we've built up to be destroyed. It needs to be systematically dismantled in order for us to enter into the Father's house. You've got to have the house of lies destroyed. And by the way, the house of lies, the blueprint of the house of lies comes from the same architect, and that is Satan. He is the architect of every house of illusions that have been built. And so in order for us to experience the Father's house, that house of illusions have to be destroyed. And so what I want to do today is examine the three specific lies that the Jews in this passage believe, because Satan doesn't lie in the broad, in the vague. He lies in the specifics. And so we need to get to the specifics to understand the truth that we have, okay? And so I'm going to read the passage again. I'm going to add two verses. I'm going to start in verse 37. And as I read it, and I know we've already read it, and as I read it, I want you to pay attention to the lies that you hear the Jews believing, okay? Because they're not necessarily explicit. I just want you to try to hear it. So I'm going to start. John chapter 8, verse 37. This is Jesus speaking. "I know that you are offspring of Abraham. Yet you seek to kill me because my word finds no place in you. I speak of what I have seen with my father, and you do what you have heard from your father." They answered him, "Abraham is our father." Jesus said to them, "If you were Abraham's children, you would be doing the works Abraham did. But now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. You are doing the works your father did." They said to him, "We were not born of sexual immorality. We have one Father, even God." Jesus said to them, "If God were your father, you would love me, for I came from God, and I am here. I came not of my own accord, but he sent me. Why do you not understand what I say? It is because you cannot bear to hear my word. You are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and has nothing to do with the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. But because I tell you the truth, you do not believe me. Which one of you convicts me of sin? If I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? Whoever is of God hears the words of God. The reason why you do not hear them is that you are not of God. Okay, so let me give you my structure, my sermon structure. It's all around these three lies. There are three lies today. Number one is that lineage determines right standing with God. That's the first one. That's what the Jews believed. Number two, that Jesus is a Gentile demon-possessed heretic. Okay, that's the second lie. And number three is that God sanctions murder. Those are the three lies that the Jews in this case believe. Now, the first question is, who is the audience? Who is Jesus having the conversation with? And I think the assumption is that Jesus is having this conversation with the Pharisees, because back in verse 13 of this chapter, it says the Pharisees said to him, and they're attacking him and questioning him who he's bearing witness of. However, there's actually a verse closer to this passage in verse 31 where it says Jesus is addressing the Jews who believed in him. If you abide in my word. Okay? In verse 31, it says, the Jews who believed in him, and he's addressing them, if you abide in my word, and then he goes into the whole section about the truth will set you free. And so, I want us to be careful here. Oftentimes, it's easy to look at this exchange where Jesus is talking, basically accusing the people he's talking to as being children of the devil, and we automatically think they're the Pharisees. That group, it may include the Pharisees. However, the most immediate referent, the pronoun that it's referring to, is the Jews who believed in him. Okay? And I want to be careful. I don't know that it would be, I think it may be too strong to say they're Christians, but at the very least, they had some kind of faith in Jesus. Okay? They had some kind of faith in Jesus. But what this tells you is even people who profess some kind of faith in Jesus may be under the influence of lies. Okay? So let's face the reality that even as Christians, we can still dwell in a house of lies, even though our permanent place is in the Father's house and in the house of truth. Okay, so lies can have an influence on all of us. All right, so that's the first kind of preface. He is addressing the Jews who believed in him. That's the audience that Jesus is talking to. Now, my first point, the first lie, is that lineage determines right standing with God. And so in this beginning of this section, there's this whole conversation, and Eddie talked about it last week, of who is Abraham's descendants, who is descendant of Abraham. And Abraham is a patriarch. He's talked about in the book of Genesis, and all Jews believe that their lineage, they are a descendant of Abraham because he's a father of their faith. And it's super, super important to understand this connection with Abraham because it's not just biological. This is also a religious and spiritual heritage that the Jews have in belonging to Abraham, because God makes a promise, what we know as a covenant. He makes a sacred promise, a sacred pact to Abraham to give him land and to give him descendants. And so all the descendants carry forward this promise of God and become the chosen people of God. So the Jews enjoy this incredible favor from God because of their lineage in Abraham. And I want you to notice in the very beginning of this passage, in verse 37, it's before what you saw on the screen, it says, I know that you are offspring of Abraham. Okay, so Jesus acknowledges, look, I understand biologically that you came out of Abraham, but there's a but. Yet you seek to kill me, because my words find no place in you. My words find no place in you. And that goes back to a word that Eddie talked about last week, which was abide. To abide is to rest or to remain in someone or something. And what Jesus is talking about is my words are supposed to abide and dwell inside of you, but they're not. They have not found a place in you. And so therefore, what's happening here is you think that having a relationship with God or having right standing with God is about biology, is the fact that you're descended from Abraham. That is a lie. Okay, that is an illusion. And I think it is super difficult for us where our ethnic and cultural, our spiritual, religious, and our national identity are all kind of fragmented. They don't all go together. But for a Jew, ethnic, cultural, political, national, religious, spiritual, they're all enwrapped in this identity of being a Jew. And make no mistake, Jesus is attacking the foundation of their identity, that their right standing with God comes from their lineage. So he acknowledges that, but he's like, hey, you know what? You don't understand. You are not behaving consistently with your legacy, with what your father represented. So where does it say that? He says in verse 37, yet you seek to kill me because my words have no place in you. And then the Jews respond in 39, Abraham is our father. And Jesus is like, I get it. I've already acknowledged that. And then Jesus says to them, if you were Abraham's children, you would be doing the works Abraham did. And so what does that mean? It's not about biology, it's about legacy. It's do you behave in the matter of your father? Okay? Do you live according to the legacy of the patriarch Abraham? Because, I totally get, the biology part and that you're descended from him, but your behavior isn't in line with the legacy of your father. You're not acting like Abraham did. And those who act like Abraham are those who are of Abraham. And if that sounds familiar, it is. It's from Romans. It's Romans chapter 4, which so many themes in Romans find their seed in this book, in the book of John, and especially John chapter 8. Okay, so what else does not determine our right standing with God? And here's where I think there's a lot of Christian misconceptions. In verse 39, it says, if you were Abraham's children, like I said, you'd be doing the works Abraham did. And so the question is, how then does one become Abraham's child? How do you become a descendant of Abraham? And I think the kind of the conception we get, especially if you've grown up in church, is if you behave correctly, then that's what makes you a descendant of Abraham. That's what makes you a Christian if you have the right behavior. But notice what Jesus is saying. He's saying, look, the sign of being a child of Abraham is you have works, you have the right behavior. It's a sign, but it is not the substance. Okay? Works are a sign, but they are not the substance. And I don't want to get quite yet to the substance, but I just want to have it acknowledged. It's not quite the same thing. The sign and the substance are not quite the same thing. And I think that's important because so much of my upbringing and background is believing that my behavior determines my right standing with God. Okay? And Daniel mentioned being Asian American. I think being the son of immigrants, my dad's from Hong Kong, my mom's from Taiwan. I grew up, and my parents, especially my dad, would give me this rags to riches story of how he was this poor immigrant, he had nothing, and it was all about, it always felt like it was geared towards guilting me. And he became a believer when I was around 13. Our whole family actually became believers at around the same time. And his value system began to change, began to shift, where I began to understand through his example, that my works do not determine right standing with God. And yet, I always felt, especially around him, because he was so critical, and one of the things he would do, like when I was 10, is he would sit us down and give us a whole bunch of work, a bunch of objectives for our life, and he mapped that from his work at IBM. And he'd be like, hey, these are your year-long goals, get straight A's, don't make your brother cry, read 40 books, and you'll get a Nintendo game if you do all those things, and those are our objectives. And of course, we never met them. Like I made my brother cry like the next day. And so I failed, and so I've always had this nagging sense of inadequacy when I'm around him. Even though he has not verbalized that, I always have this nagging sense of inadequacy around him because there's this lie that I believed that works determine my right standing with God. Because any core lie is ultimately going to be about your identity. And for the Jews, they had everything wrapped up in one. Okay, so if you were to come to me and say, hey, you know what? You're a bad Chinese person. You don't eat deep fried crickets, and you're also a bad son because you haven't lived up to your father's legacy, and you're also a bad Christian because you don't live up to Jesus. If you wrap all those things up in one, that's what it was like for Jesus to attack the Jews and say, hey, you know what? You're not descendant of Abraham. It hits all those buttons. It's a tough lie to allow to be destroyed. Let's go to the next one. Jesus is a Gentile demon-possessed heretic. Okay? Jesus is a Gentile demon-possessed heretic. Now, someone who attacks your ethnic and cultural identity must not be of the same tribe. Okay? They can't be from the same tribe. Because if they're telling you you're not part of the tribe, well, They must not be in your tribe either, right? That's the logic in here, okay? And I want you to notice there's something super strange going on in verse 41. It's completely random, but it says in verse 41, we were not born of sexual immorality. Where did that come from? Anybody? Where did that come from? Did Jesus accuse the Jews of being born of sexual immorality? Really asking. No. There is no accusation that any of the Jews were born of sexual immorality. So it's really weird that they go, we're not born of sexual immorality. Okay, so why would they say that? So I want you to add this to that line, what the Jews are saying. We were not born of, they're addressing Jesus, we were not born of sexual immorality like you, Jesus. Okay, that's what they're saying, okay? They're making an accusation. Now, we homeschool, 3 of our kids are homeschooled, and so the way we approach those, we talk about logic. That's called a genetic fallacy. That argument is called a genetic fallacy, where it's irrelevant to the argument the other person's making, and you just attack their origin story. Okay, so here's what the Jews are doing. They're like, we're not gonna actually interact with anything you said. We're just gonna say you were born out of sexual, you're a bastard. Okay, so rather than address the attack on their religious lineage and their right standing with God, the Jews don't do that. They're like, we're just going to attack your lineage. Okay, we're going to attack where you came from. Okay, it's completely unrelated, but here's the thing: lies stack. Okay, lies stack. You have stackable coupons, right? When you go online. Okay, lies stack on top of each other. Okay? And lies stack on the foundation of identity. And you start with the core lie that the Jews believed about themselves, that lineage determines right standing with God, and that gets attacked, and then you will then create a lie to defend against it, and that means attacking the person that said it. So there are times when we're confronted with the truth and it attacks our core identity, then because we're not going to allow that illusion to be destroyed, we're going to attack back. And that's exactly what the Jews do here. And by the way, where did they get this idea that Jesus was born of sexual immorality? Well, because Joseph was betrothed to Mary, and then she got pregnant. And that just doesn't happen without a man involved, right? Because having the Holy Spirit conceive of something, that wasn't something they were really used to, right? That any of us are used to, but that happened, right? And so what the Jews' perception was is, look, your whole birth story is tainted, is immoral, because your mom was engaged or betrothed at the time and basically had sex outside of marriage, right? And that's your birth story, and that's how we're going to discredit you. That's how we're going to address your argument, by finding something completely unrelated. What else is unrelated? In verse 48, we didn't read it, but I'll read it right now. The Jews answered him, "Are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon?" I mean, it's almost silly, right? It's almost silly the way that the Jews are attacking Jesus, because it really has nothing to do with any of the arguments Jesus is making. You see what I'm saying? We know when we're being confronted by the truth, if we won't address the truth of what someone else is saying, and we just resort to character attack. But that's exactly what the Jews are doing. They're attacking his character. They're saying, hey, we want it both ways. Number one, he is demon-possessed and he's a Samaritan, right? And here's the thing that's interesting about that. If Jesus is demon-possessed, what that means is he's out of his mind, and he doesn't really know what he's saying, okay? But if he's a heretic, then he knows what he's saying, and he's doing it intentionally, and he should be killed, okay? So either he should be killed, or he's demon-possessed, because what's the right response with a demon-possessed person? Yeah, cast out the demon. You address the source of the problem, which is the demon, right? But the fact that they want to kill him contradicts, you know what I mean, their statement that he's demon-possessed. Because really, they're just throwing everything, right? They're just like making a bunch of character attacks against him, and they're hoping something about it would stick. Okay? And again, this is what happens when we are defending something core about our identity, because lies stack, and they stack on the foundation of identity. All right, last one. Last lie that these Jews believe. And it's that God sanctions murder, okay? God sanctions murder. And now we're going to get into the section, and we're going to understand a little more about Satan's ploys and how Satan works, how the devil works. So verse 44 says, You are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. Okay, so these are strong words that Jesus is making. Okay, these are extremely strong words that Jesus is making. And again, the Jews they don't defend themselves against them. They're not actually addressing the core of Jesus' argument. But Jesus goes on and he explains, he, the devil, was a murderer from the beginning and has nothing to do with truth because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. Father has a number of meanings in the scriptures. Father can mean ruler or sovereign, someone who has the right to rule over a group of people or a family in this case. Father also means source. It also means originator. So when Jesus says the devil is the father of lies, he means he is the source of lies. Lies come from him. So the question is, where do we see that throughout Scripture? Okay, if you go back to the book of Genesis, to the first lie, it is with Adam and Eve in the garden, and it is the devil in the form of a serpent saying to Eve, did God really say? Did God really say this? And this idea that God, the serpent was essentially taking advantage of FOMO, right? Fear of missing out on the part of Eve to say, hey, you know what? God is holding out on you. He's got something really good for you, but he doesn't want you to have it. Okay, so he is attacking the character, he was implicitly attacking the character of God with that lie. And every lie has some kernel of truth. There's always some distortion of truth. It's also said that Satan hates us. Okay, and I'm not going to say that it's wrong, but just know that throughout Scripture, especially in the book of John, it is very specific that Satan wants to kill. And then in John 10:10, it says Satan sets out to steal, kill, and destroy. Okay, and that's not exactly. I know that it sounds like hatred. I know, but I think what Satan actually delights in, especially in light of this passage, is he loves to lead people down a path of destruction. And how does that leadership occur? How does that persuasion occur? It occurs through lies. Lies are the path to destruction. Okay, lies are the path to murder. Okay, so what's another example of murder? What's the first murder? You have Cain and Abel. Okay, Cain and Abel is the first murder. And so what I'm going to propose here is that at the heart of any murder, at the heart of any murderous intent is a lie, is a deception, is an illusion. Okay, so when you look at Cain and Abel, and both Cain and Abel offer a sacrifice to God, and God looks with favor on Abel's offering, but does not look with favor on Cain's offering, there is a lie that Cain believed. Okay, and that lie was this: my identity as the oldest son, my identity as in lineage, my lineage determines right standing with God. Okay? And because I'm the oldest son, you should be able to take this offering and accept it. And yet that's not what happens. That's not the reality. The offering was rejected. Okay? And it would have been a good time for Cain to reflect on his own actions, but he doesn't. And he says, you know what? The problem in this situation is my brother. Okay? Just like the Jews attacked Jesus. Because his core identity, this illusion about his worth based on his right standing, based on his lineage, is being threatened, he chooses to attack the person closest to him, his younger brother. And so the murderous intent comes out of this belief in a lie that threatens his identity. And so I think it's worth kind of thinking about where are we today as a culture in terms of murder? Right? Where are we as a culture today in terms of murder? By a lot of metrics, we're doing quite well. As far as I know, I believe, I think I've been told this, that the murder rate in most countries has gone down, has declined significantly. And yet it really doesn't feel that way, right? It really doesn't feel that way from the way the media talks about active shooters, including in faith settings, which has been very recent. I'll be doing an active shooter briefing, a safety briefing today at Garden City. We meet in the afternoons. And so there is this idea that even though the murder rate may have gone down, the publicity around mass shootings, around murder, is greater than ever before in history. The second thing I would say that demonstrates a murderous culture is the political climate of a country. And I think you can make a good argument today that we are more polarized than ever when it comes to political discussion. That a lot of the discourse, both online and in person, is murderous, okay? It's hateful, right? It is hateful. And then the last reason I might say we still live in a murderous culture, right? And there's always been murderous cultures, and it just has different manifestations, is if you look at the incidence of mental health issues, especially among young people, there's a rising rate of anxiety and depression among young people it's just skyrocketed. And it may be the case that in years past we have not diagnosed those properly. And yet there's something different going on, something unprecedented going on in the way young people and the way people care about themselves and think about themselves. And amidst that, there's this idea that it's good or important even to hurt yourself, okay? And out of that has sprung this movement to believe that you can love yourself, that it's important to care for oneself and to love oneself, okay? And so how do we think about that in terms of murder and lies? Well, let's first recognize that if you have a hatred of yourself, if you have a desire to hurt yourself, okay, that's a form of murder, okay? Can we acknowledge that? Can we at least think about that idea? Second, if it is true that murder comes from believing a lie, and lies stack on the foundation of identity, then when you have a desire to hurt yourself, when someone has that instinct to want to hurt themselves, there is a lie that the person is believing. And the path to helping someone address the desire to hurt themselves isn't through self-love, because guess what? Your love is not enough. Your love is not enough. You cannot love yourself enough, okay? Because you have to confront the lie that you're believing, that your opinion of yourself is the one that matters most. Because here is the gospel, and this is the truth, is that God's love, is his view of you, matters more than anything else, and that is the foundation of identity. And so when we talk about self-care and self-love, ultimately, that is a lie, okay? That is a lie, because it is the love of God that transforms and that brings truth. And unfortunately, what you have to do in order to receive that truth is let go and allow your house of illusions to be destroyed. The things that you have been founding your identity on have to be destroyed. And what I have been wrestling with as an overachieving Asian American is I need to allow the truth of God to destroy this house of illusions that I've built, that the things that I do matter, that my works matter, that success as a pastor matters to my worth, that the size of my church and my job title, all those things matter in terms of right standing with God, because that's what I'm tempted to believe. And you know what? You know what the biggest temptation for pastors, and you'll notice this too, is a lot of it's about comparison. Right? It's comparison and attacks from within your congregation, okay? It's attacks within your congregation, right? And it's so fascinating to me that Jesus faced the most opposition from those closest to him and the religious leadership, because they felt threatened by him. Their identity was threatened by him, and the only way they knew how to address the lie of their identity was to attack him. And you will see that in the church. And that's what I've experienced. And I have seen that for myself, where I have believed into the lie that works to determine my value. And so let me in closing, let me ask a couple things. There is a specific lie that you are believing today. And the way that you're going to get to the core of it is by beginning to have some reflection on some murderous impulses that you're experiencing, okay? Because if you pull on that thread of murder, you'll get to some lies, you'll get to some deception, because Satan's the father of those. That's where he starts, okay? And so if you're wrestling with some murderous impulses, and I just mean hate, right? I just mean some hateful impulses, bitterness or resentment towards someone maybe who's close to you, Okay, and especially if you're in the church or you're a leader, it's probably other leaders. Okay, it's probably going to be other leaders. And the presence of those leaders probably threatens some aspect of your identity. Okay, it's probably threatening some aspect of your identity. And the other thing too, for some of you, that murderous instinct is directed toward yourself. And there's a lie that you're believing about yourself as well. Would you allow that instinct to lead you to be more specific about the core lie that you're believing about identity, about where your worth comes from? Because Satan is reveling in that. He is the father of lies. And so as you reflect on that, we talked about then what is the basis of right standing. Well, in Romans 4, it says that the offspring of Abraham share in the faith of Abraham. The offspring of Abraham share in the faith of Abraham. So what that means is, in order to be able to hear the words of God, you need a supernatural breakthrough. Because God doesn't bring murder. God doesn't bring death. God brings life. You need to be born again. And that's what Jesus talks about in John chapter 3. And so when he says, those who are born of God, those who are of God, hear the word of God, you don't need any more arguments. What you need is a supernatural breakthrough for the Spirit of God to awaken you to his truth. That's what it means to be converted, to be born again. It's a supernatural work of God to destroy your house of illusions and for it to be built back. Because it sounds like he's giving a circular argument, and it is. Something has to break through and bring truth. And the only way that truth is brought is if those illusions are destroyed. And then we can discover and receive faith in Jesus Christ. So would you ask God today, would he reveal the areas where you have either destructive or self-destructive thoughts? Would that allow a thread to be pulled to be able to see the lies that you are buying into about the foundation of your identity and worth? And as God shows you the illusions that you are working so hard to prevent from being destroyed, that you are working to preserve, would he also give you this image of the house, the Father's house that Eddie painted last week, the house of permanence and stability and affection, an unconditional love that he wants to give you? Would, as you die to one, would he bring life for the other? But recognize you can't have this, you can't have the life without going through the death and the surrender first. Let's pray together.